I am Dan Manning. So I'm the lead instructor for human intelligence, and I teach people how to think, right? How to think better critically, how to think better creatively, and how to think better collaboratively. And I'm really pleased to be able to do this session with my new friend, Becky. So Becky, I'll allow you to introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Becky Fraser. I am a leadership and development coach, and I started my coaching practice, Focus for Growth, in 2015. And so I actually coined the term introverted skeptic a couple of years ago and have been kind of developing some ideas and perspectives around that. And so excited to talk to you about that with Dan here today.
Great, thanks. So before I started doing this, I spent 25 years in the Air Force. So I spent about half of that time as a fighter pilot flying the A-10 and the other half of the time as a military diplomat. But what I didn't understand was that throughout that whole time, I was pretty much an introverted skeptic. When you look at the personality test, I tend to land in the middle of each of those. I'm not too far to either side, but certainly the way that I interact with energy that we'll talk about in a second was certainly from, thank you, Teresa, was certainly from the inside, right? I do my thinking on the inside, I get my energy from the inside, and that's sort of how I was powered. And now in my business, I work to help people to be more skeptical, right? To be skeptical about themselves, to be skeptical about the information that they receive so that we can really get to the real problems that face us so that we can solve those. So what I'd like to do is put up a poll and ask you, if you don't mind, if you could share with us where you put yourself sort of on the introverted, extroverted spectrum. Just say, all right, so here's the results. So of the group that we have here, most people tend towards the leaning introverted, but certainly we have a good representation of people who are solidly the ambiverts, right? People that are right sort of in the middle of those two, and then a couple of people identifying themselves as very introverted. So thank you. I really appreciate you sharing your answers with us. And I think it's important for us to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. So I'd like to ask Becky, do you mind giving us just some definitions of what we're talking about today to ensure we're all on the same page?
Yeah, sure. And just a little bit more background too about kind of where this started for me and how I kind of developed some of this language and some of this perspective. I spent a little bit around 15 years, I try not to count too closely, in human resources and in a variety of different roles. And during that time, really kind of self-identified as a business person who happened to do HR. And I made a decision to kind of carve out the pieces of that kind of work that I had been doing when I started my coaching practice. And that led me to really think about who are the people I want to coach, who are the people I love to spend time with and interact with. And it kind of came down to two different groupings of people. The introverts, and the way that I think about introversion is if you think Susan Cain and quiet, some of that space, a lot of this idea about where is your energy source? Is it that you kind of refuel by being alone or in a small familiar kind of group? Or is it that you're kind of out and about and you refill by being in social engagement? Um, I always think about my sister and I in situations like this because I'm the one who is really excited with a Kindle and a cat and sitting at home by myself and refueling that way. And my sister has been going bonkers during the pandemic because she's not able to kind of interact and be seeing people in person because even just like this is insufficient for her in terms of kind of filling that need for refueling. So she really struggles with that. Who knows, right? You grow up in the same household and how different you can be with that. And so there's also this idea too of a response to stimulation and how much kind of you end up in this place of overwhelm in some of those scenarios. And one of the times that this really stood out for me is I don't know if any of you have ever driven through the state of South Dakota. It's cornfield, cornfield, flat, 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 cornfield, cornfield. And then you hit the city or town, whatever, of wall. And it is full of tchotchkes and all of this stuff. And I remember walking into one of the stores and I looked at my friend and I said, I'll be in the truck. I couldn't even spend 10 seconds inside of there because I just had this sense of complete overwhelm, thought I was going to hyperventilate and walked out. And it really comes down to this outside stimulation of how much that can really affect how we are. And it also kind of ties into depth of relationships, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well as we keep on going. The other piece of it is the skepticism. And this is where it taps into my deep and abiding love for understanding and connecting with how people think and process information. So, a clear, full kind of skeptic is the one who will stand there and say to you that nothing can be known with certainty. Everything should be questioned all of the time. Nothing is known. That's one extreme of that. You'll find as I talk, I speak in spectrums a lot. At the other end of that spectrum is really just maybe not accepting everything at face value and wanting to seek and understand. So there are a lot of questions getting asked. So positive skepticism has a tendency toward problem solving, generating ideas and solutions, things along that line. So at a really high level, that's sort of where I define the introvert and the skeptic. And as you combine those two traits together, some really interesting things happen, especially when you mix it with the full array of all of the other traits that we all have as individuals and complex humans.
Yeah, thank you. So I also found in the research that when people sort of do these categorizations, it turns out that about 15 to 16% of the population identifies as an introvert, and about 15 to 16% of the population identifies as an extrovert. But that middle section, the spectrum that you're talking about, right, that middle section is a full 2/3 of the population. So when we're talking about who is fully introverted on one side of the spectrum or fully extroverted on the other side, those turn out to be relatively thin slices. Most of us and most of the people we interact with are going to be somewhere on the middle piece there. And as the title is Thriving as an Introverted Skeptic in a Shortcut World, shortcuts are something that I talk a lot about in my practice and with my clients. And usually when I talk about shortcuts, I talk about them in terms of the mental shortcuts that we take, right? The mental shortcuts that our brains take to be able to make sense of the world around us, which are often very, very crude and lead us to incorrect conclusions sometimes, just so that we can think quickly. But in this case, I also want to explore a little bit about the shortcuts that exist in our world. And as I've thought about it, many of these shortcuts that exist are really oriented, not favoring the introverts, right? They tend to favor more people with a more extroverted personality. Things like social media, for instance, right? Social media values hundreds or maybe thousands of very shallow relationships, whereas introverts tend to gravitate towards fewer and deeper relationships. And social media just simply isn't the place for us to develop those sorts of deeper relationships. You have to take the conversation somewhere else to be able to do that. Also, introverts tend to value deep understanding of a subject, right? Like in preparation for this is a subject I know a lot about, but I still spent many hours preparing. Like, what do I really think about this, and what are the implications of those thoughts, and how can I turn those implications into things that are valuable for someone else? And that is not the Google world that we live in, right? You can Google something and in 2 seconds become a Google expert on a subject, but that isn't the same as the way that introverts tend to like to consume information and really mull it over and decide what it is that they think about things. And then one of the last ones I think about is essentially the fundamental attribution error. And this is a term for where we make conclusions about a person's character based on one element of their behavior, right? So one of the most common examples is if you're driving along and I see someone that goes, speeding past me, or they don't stop completely at the stop sign. And what do you think about that type of person yourself? Right? We all tend to have some words that come to mind. Maybe that person's a maniac or they're reckless, and then there's been studies where people will then extrapolate that one example of behavior to who is most likely to cheat on their taxes. Well, it's probably the person that ran the red light, when there's really no relationship between those. But this also happens in the world now with, for instance, with masks. I live now in the South, just north of Birmingham, and for a while, you could, when people went into a store wearing a mask, people would draw some conclusions about that person's politics, maybe how they feel about climate change, maybe their feeling about science in general. And then I myself, I would see someone walk in without wearing a mask, and I could catch myself thinking, well, that person, clearly they're a bad human, right? They don't believe in science. They are not taking care of the people that are around them. And I would concoct all of these stories that sort of add on to why they weren't wearing a mask. Until one day I found myself in Home Depot and I wasn't wearing a mask, right? Because I had forgotten, right? And I gave myself the space for all of these excuses for why I had forgotten it, right? I rode my dad's truck rather than my car, so it wasn't in the place where it was. So I gave these excuses to myself, but I didn't give them to other people. And for the introverted skeptic, in the end, it takes time, right? It takes time to work through that line of thinking to come to a conclusion, right? To sort through that initial response that, well, this person, it behaves this way because they are this type of person, and actually get to the place that you need. And time just isn't something that we have a lot of in the world that we live in. So, Becky, I'm curious, in your practice, with the introverted skeptics that you work with, is there something that tends to come up often? And as you're preparing to answer that, I will say again that the chat's open, so feel free to continue talking to the chat. You can ask questions there. We are going to take a break at 20 minutes after the hour to allow you to sort of consolidate your thoughts and give some time for both introverts and extroverts to sort of decide what they think about what we're talking about, and a time to formulate a question there as well. But Becky, in your practice, what do you see?
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I would respond to is this idea of, well, there are two things. One is the depth versus breadth component. And I guess I would even tie that to the other thing that you were talking about there, which is sort of that I see this one thing and therefore I think I know this whole story about this
Mhm.
individual. And when I think about, someone that you might be seeing and they're going really deep, they're spending a lot of time thinking about something and we think, oh, they're an introvert. And as a
Mhm.
result of that, then there are all of these things that we start assuming about how they're going to show up and how they're going to relate to us and everything. And we don't necessarily invest our time in that curiosity to really discover who that person is and what is really going on for them. It might be that they're just highly pedantic and they're
Mhm.
very choosy about the words that they use all of the time. They're choosy about with whom they might use that. And at the same time, they might be someone who is what I describe more as a systems thinker. So they start thinking a lot more about the breadth of a situation and almost that butterfly effect. If I make this change over here, how does it affect everything over here as well?
Mhm.
And that may or may not be that introversion piece of things that is showing up in that single point characteristic. And this is one of the reasons that I like to combine it with the skeptic as well, because they're constantly questioning. And so then they're often given this trait of, well, they're a troublemaker. They don't
Right.
accept anything. They won't let us move anything forward. And again, we have this opportunity to kind of step back and say, what is it that we can learn from someone who is always asking all of these questions and
Mhm.
trying to explore all of these components in different situations. And so when I'm coaching people, I'm really working with them thinking about how else might I see this? What are some of the assumptions that I'm making about this situation or about this individual that if I got really curious and started thinking about them as a whole person instead
Mhm.
of just these one or two traits. One of my regular rants is the idea of some of these assessments where we put our rating up on our wall or on our emails or whatever they might be.
Mhm.
And my concern about that is always that then we risk having a
Mhm.
label associated with us. And we as humans are bigger than any label that anyone can ever give to us. And so it becomes this question of what else am I in addition to these one or two characteristics, and how does the rest of my personality kind of tie into these pieces? That to me is what's really interesting about people and how
Right.
they think about problems and how they solve them.
No, I think it's a great point that we one of the shortcuts that our brains like to take is to say, well, that person's an introvert, and therefore all of these things apply to that person as well. When if people are complex, right? So it takes some time to get to know them. I know, myself, even though I, on those tests that you're talking about, I tend to fall more into the center of those. Like, I'm definitely a person that does my thinking on the inside. And as I was thinking about, what are some tips that I can give someone about how to thrive as an introverted skeptic in a shortcut world, I was thinking about the fact that probably the number one thing that you can do to help yourself is to practice saying, I don't know yet, right? That we tend to, like, the worst case scenario meeting for me was when the boss would call an impromptu meeting and it's about some important subject, and now the boss will lay out, like, here's what we're doing, here's the problem that we need to face, and now people just start shouting ideas out. And in order to be a contributing member of that team, I want to be skeptical of what other people are saying, not in a derogatory way, but just to understand what assumptions are they making about the problem. But if I'm thinking about what they're saying, I'm not putting enough thought myself into what I actually understand and what I believe about something. So now, as you get near the end of the meeting, people need to start acting, and maybe the boss turns to me and says, "All right, so what do you think?" And, like, I honestly, I don't know yet. I have no idea what I think yet, because I need the time to digest everything that I've heard, and now I can come back to you in a little bit with something that's more well formed. But simply, one, saying I don't know isn't something that's typically valued in our culture, right? It's something
Mm-hmm.
that's people often see as a sign of weakness. But if you want to know what you think as an introverted skeptic, you need to take that time to be able to consolidate your thoughts and offer them up. So I
Yeah.
do see. I'm sorry, Becky, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, especially when we have leadership from a management authority perspective, and there's this embedded belief that has been developed over time that as a leader, I'm supposed to be able to answer all of your questions and tell you what to do and where are we going to go, and how empowering it can be for the entire team when a
Hmm.
leader stands there and says, you know what, let's just take a hot minute, sort through these things for a second, figure out what we think might be good opportunities here, where the advantages to going one direction versus another, and really generating ideas so that it's not about one person coming to a conclusion. It's about generating those ideas. And how you do that can really be powerful in terms of just, okay, let's just go quiet for a second. And maybe the extroverts can be bubbling along, writing things down madly, and the introverts can be processing those ideas and those thoughts on a kind of a quiet basis and being able to generate it that way. It's powerful.
Yes, and in fact, that's what we are going to do right now, because we're 20 minutes past the hour. I love what's going on in the chat, talking about being able to say I don't know and not staying there. Right? I don't know yet. That yet part is pretty important. I will know what I think in a little bit, but it's going to take me some time. So what I'd like to do right now is we're going to take 3 minutes of silence from us, and allow you to consolidate your thoughts. If you want to share something in the chat, you can do that. When we come back, I'll ask if anyone wants to come off mute and share something out loud or ask a question, and then we'll press on with the rest of it. So 3 minutes starting now. All right, so coming back from that 3 minutes, there's great stuff in the chat. It's continuing, so please allow that to keep going. I do want to give space if someone wants to speak and ask a question out loud. We can take that right now as well. You can just come off mute if you'd like.
Hey, Dan, this
So
is
Kevin,
Kevin.
please. Yeah, Kevin, welcome.
Thank you. Question to Becky. Can you pull on that thread about low correlation between introversion and confidence? I found that I often come across, at least initially, as arrogant because I'm both confident and quiet. And that is how I'm. So arrogant is what people perceive in that out of me. Can you just pull on that thread a little bit, and if there's any other ways to maybe come across less arrogant, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it is interesting when those two things do come together. I would guess that you're not alone in having people kind of make those judgments. It goes back to, I see these two things and therefore I make up this story about this individual and I really don't know what's going on. And one of the things that I and I'm also stuck on this idea, so I just have to share it out loud because otherwise it's going to be stuck in there. But one of my husband's favorite lines, and he's deeply introverted, deeply skeptical, and highly confident. Those three characteristics all come together in one person, in addition to a bunch of marvelous other things that I admire about him. But one of his lines is, humility is my second best characteristic, right? Because perfection is, of course, the first. And so, with that, Kevin, my thought with that for you is really how is it that you can connect so that what you're sharing or saying when you are talking really reinforces and acknowledges and validates what the other person is saying when they're speaking? Because as introverts, there is a tendency to be really strong listeners because it's what we spend our time kind of doing, is being in observation mode and seeing what's happening. And if you can essentially say that back, what they've said, it's kind of that improv thing of a yes and, so that it shows that you're acknowledging how smart you see they are in that particular moment, or at least that you're hearing and validating what they're saying from their perspective. Because one of the other things that I hear from people on a regular basis is I don't know how to tell them that they have a really stupid idea without it coming across as I'm being a jerk and arrogant and all of these other things. And I would argue that acknowledging and validating isn't agreeing. Acknowledging and validating is telling the other person that you've heard what they said and you understand that that is the conclusion based on their thought process. And then it gives you this beautiful space to add, and I have these other thoughts about this, and this is how I see it. And it softens a disagreement. Does that help and kind of clarify, Kevin?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'd also like to add to that, Becky. One of the things that I often talk about is encouraging people to begin their questions with an "I'm curious," and then if you can back that up with a "you said," and then sort of repeat back so that they feel like they were heard, and you've disarmed by saying not whether I agree or disagree, but I'm curious. Like, I want to understand more about your thinking about this. That helps to soften that blow a little bit as well. And also, if you don't mind, I'd like to relate, as we were doing some of the preparation for this this session, right? So the two of us are talking. We're on screen together, and one of the things I noticed was that when I was talking to you, I was not getting any feedback back, right? That you were interpreting the words that I was saying, and you were trying to decide what you thought about them, and you were not yet ready to either give me a positive nod or any type of reaction that I would typically expect from lots of other people. But because we're having a conversation about introversion, like, I knew that this was your way of thinking, right? That you were thinking about what I was saying, and that you were giving me the gift of attention rather than just a response that you were giving there. So if you are working with other people that are identifying as introverts, like, giving them the space to have a blank face is not bad, right? Giving them the space to have a blank face allows them to think about what they're saying. And then if you allow pauses in your conversation, then you may be rewarded with hearing what they actually think about it.
Yeah, and just as the second half of that too, just to share with the group that as Dan told me that, one of the things that I said was both in my HR career, where I was trying to collect full information before having a perspective that I would share back with a leader or an employee or what have you, I didn't want to signal back to someone in the organization a certain point of view that was not fully formed. And then I moved into coaching, and I really pride myself on not giving advice when I'm coaching, and I really pay attention and listen in those moments. So there's a little bit of natural tendency and a little bit of higher end training that I put myself through in terms of just absorb, collect. And it was interesting to recognize what that looks like on the other side and how other people might be perceiving some of those situations.
Mhm.
One of the things I talk about a lot, whether it's our thought process or actual physically what we're working on in terms of projects, is always this idea of show your work. Incrementally find a cadence to be connecting with your stakeholders or with your audience to make sure that, am I still on the same track? Am I hearing you correctly? Where are we heading? Whatever those questions might be, but asking those questions and doing those check-ins with someone to know that you're still in alignment, because sometimes we stick to the beginning and we don't always end up in the same place because we took different mental paths.
Oh, that's great. So thank you, Kevin, for asking the question. I'd also like to open it up if there's someone else that wanted to come off mute and ask a question. Some new comments there in the chat as well from Jason. Yeah. So Jason, could you want to expand on what you
Sure.
put there in the chat? Yeah.
Yeah. I was just thinking, I mean, I always struggle figuring out which box, if any, I fit into on the introvert or extrovert scale there. So I mean, like, first and foremost, I enjoy like going out, being with people, and but also tend to be the one that's like listening and may chime in with like responses here and here, but keep it on sort of more to the point than like small talk and other aspects there. So I mean, I guess some characteristics of both, but don't really know which box which box to fit into.
Yeah. So Becky, I'd love to hear what you think about this. As I was thinking through this for myself, I found myself being an introvert that can pretend to be an extrovert pretty well, right? That I can do something like this, where I can come and I can present and carry on a conversation. Or back when I was in the military, I was a defense attaché for part of the time. So part of that job was going to cocktail parties and meeting people, and I could do that. But when I left, I was done. Right, I was spent. I will go home and after this, I'll go play a video game for a couple of hours. And I'm fortunate to be in a relationship with my wife that understands that me playing a video game is not doing nothing. Right? For an introvert, doing nothing is actually how you get your energy back. So whether it's playing a video game or going for a walk, or maybe it's reading a book, or maybe it's playing with my dogs, what other people may see as doing nothing is actually allowing me to do something later. And I think that's a different way that you have to sort of look at the world that you live in. Whereas if you're an extrovert and you're getting your energy by being out with other people and doing, as I'm saying it myself, right, doing things, right, that sort of counts in their list of being a responsible human, right? They get the double advantage of getting their energy while they're doing stuff. So I'm in the same boat with you, and I don't think it matters so much about what letter you assign to yourself. What matters is, how do you get the energy that you need to do the things that you want to do? Is it by being alone sometimes, or is it with other people? But Becky, I'd love to hear your expertise.
Yeah, so a couple of things with that. I mean, especially when it comes to close relationships and kind of navigating how do we communicate back and forth in terms of what our energy refueling needs to be. Sometimes an introvert might be spending a lot of time with an extrovert. I think about travel time. I used to travel internationally with a friend of mine who was farther on the introversion scale than I was, and we would take a day in the middle of our week of travel and just say, this is me day, and I love you, I don't want to be with you today. And we would just go separately and be where we wanted to be. And it was openly acknowledged that we just needed to go into our own little bubble in our space. And I also have a friend of mine who had he was very young, and he'll hate me later when he knows that I've been using this story forever. But he was about 4 or 5 years old, and he was in his class, and they were talking about kindness buckets. And so when his mother wanted him to put his toys away, he told her that she wasn't filling up his kindness bucket, right? And of course, it was in this shrieking, crying, desperate kind of voice. And when I think about that through the lens of the introvert, I think we don't want to be this 4 or 5 year old young boy who is kind of at that point of desperation, needing that bucket to be refilled. We want to be the person who is constantly paying attention to how that gets filled up, whatever that source of energy needs to be in that particular point in time. I would totally agree with Dan. The letter never matters. What matters is you and your unique experience and how you fill yourself up and have that capacity to interact in whatever way is the most productive for you. Because one of the other kind of burned statements that I wish never existed and certainly would fall off the planet now is that whole fake it till you make it. No, no, nay, nay. That should never, ever be said again, in my view. You can act as if, and that is different than faking it until you make it, because when you're faking something, you never believe it's coming true. And if you act as if something is going to happen, if you act as if I am prepared and ready to engage with this large group of people, then you can find your path to doing that. If you feel like you're faking it, you're draining yourself even more.
No, that's true. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
So we do have a couple of questions. I want to make sure we don't go past them. Teresa had asked a question earlier about if you've seen any type of correlation between EQ, right, between emotional intelligence, right, emotional quotient, and introvert or extrovert. Have you come across that at all in your work, Becky? And then Sandra has one as well.
Yes. So the emotional intelligence. So the way that I think about emotional intelligence is a little bit different than the typical 4 box that you see in most programs. The one that I work with is really self-awareness, self-management, relationship management, stress management, and then also decision making. So this actually ties into both introversion and the skeptic when it comes to this. So introversion becomes this question of we don't necessarily tap into self-awareness until we have a conversation. Because again, much like Mish was talking about, where you can both be confident and also you can be an introvert, it's also true that you can be grossly unaware or aware of yourself and your emotions when it comes to that. So really kind of recognizing and seeing how self-aware you are. Where it really shows up is this interpersonal side of connecting with other people and how we manage our energy when it is connected to other people. Do we really kind of focus on a small number of individuals? And then when they're not like us and they don't kind of fall into that favorite group bucket, how is it that we extend ourselves to work with the people whose style might be a little bit frustrating for us? And how do we push ourselves into those spaces and also accept that we can learn from them? Because one of the major foundational pieces from my coaching program was everyone is your student and your teacher. So when they really annoy you, just ask yourself, what are they teaching me in this moment? And what can I teach them? And it becomes a little bit of a different gaze into that space. The other thing that I like to point out about emotional intelligence component with the decision making is a really big component of impulse control, which can be tied to introversion, extroversion, but also one of the key components is reality testing. Like, what is it that I'm observing and how real is it versus my made up stories about things? And that's the skeptic side of it. So emotional intelligence can have a very interesting view for you to observe yourself and see how you connect with others and where you might choose to expand that.
Awesome. Thank you.
You bet.
So we're just about to come up on another break, but I wanted to address Sandra's question as well. So Sandra had asked, like in 2 separate posts. One had talked about sort of being skeptical with yourself, and then secondly about how to avoid going down a dead-end skeptical rabbit hole in a meeting, particularly in public when other people are around. Am I correctly capturing your question there, Sandra?
Yeah, well, and particularly just the inclination to just shut down, because it's easier to shut down and shut up and write people off than it is to get out of my introversion and engage and really reach them with curiosity instead of the
Yeah.
skepticism that I'm pretty sure is right.
Right. So for me, I am most skeptical about myself, right? And Dr. Richard Feynman has had a great quote that said, "You must never fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool." Right. So most of the work that I do is about being introspective and considering what types of assumptions am I making, what types of cognitive illusions have I created, what types of biases do I have. I tend to think that I'm a pretty smart person, but the more I talk to other people, I realize how many gaps I have in my knowledge, right? And that by talking to other people, it exposes those gaps and it allows me to fill them in. So what I try to do is be genuinely curious about why this other person thinks this thing. And if I start from a place where this other person is smart also, what am I missing that this person sees? And sometimes that can get me to the place, right? If I am able to have a trusting, psychologically safe environment, then I've created the foundation that allows me to ask about their thinking without being critical of them as a human, right? So if you start with that trust foundation, you'll be much better off getting there. The other thing that I remember happening was I had a boss who was one of the most extroverted people I have ever met, and the staff meetings that he would run would be exhausting because we would show up at a meeting and maybe the purpose of the meeting was to get a decision from him. Or maybe it was simply for him to have a meeting to see what happens because he did all of his thinking on the outside. So the meeting would start and he would give his opinion or maybe even give direction about things to do. And in the military, we're pretty particular about if somebody tells us to do something, then that's something I should probably be doing. But if I started doing the thing that he said at the beginning of the meeting, the next day I missed everything that happened because he would change his not just his opinion but his entire approach through the course of the meeting. Because what we would normally do, introverts would normally do, are thinking on the inside, and before I speak I would know what I thought about something. He would simply start talking and his thinking would evolve over time so that by the time you get to the end of the meeting, that might be the thing that he actually thought. So one of the tips that I would give for working with people like that is to, one, you've got to be patient, right? Allow the thinking to evolve. But two, once you think you've gotten to that last place, write it down and then essentially read it back to them or send them an email and say, here's where I think that meeting ended. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And that way it lets both of you know that you're on the right track. And Becky, see if you have anything to add to that before we take another quick break.
Yeah, I mean, what I would do is also show your work, right? When it comes to that, of let them kind of burn themselves out a little bit in terms of generating ideas and coming to that final solution that they have. Even as an introvert, I will tell you that when I was in corporate, and it may still be a little bit true, but it's mostly just affecting me these days, is I would get a great idea at the very last minute and go, hey, let's do this, and then run forward in that particular direction. And I needed, as a leader, when I had a team, to be able to control that. So part of it is also heightening the awareness of the people who are sitting in those meetings to say, I'm noticing that we're kind of following a whole path here, and I'm not sure where the trail is supposed to end. So if we can really get an idea of by the end of this meeting, what do we want to achieve? So at least we have a mutually agreed upon target for the end, then we're at least heading in another direction. The other thing that I like to keep handy now, because I get a chance to quote Walt Whitman, which honestly, not normal in my personality, is this quote that he has from Camden Conversations. And I can only assume that the attribution is correct because, as you might imagine, as old as I am, I have not heard him say it directly. It is, I like the scientific spirit, the holding off, the being sure but not too sure, the willingness to surrender ideas when the evidence is against them. And I think that applies not only to ideas, but about situations and circumstances. It's also the ideas that we have about people. So when we start making up the stories about people, about this is what they're thinking, I wish they would just stop talking, and all of that story starts happening in our minds, that we can start testing ourselves. There was someone, I think it was even you, Sandra, who was saying that kind of skeptical with myself. And it comes back to, what am I believing about this person right now? And how true is that really?
Great. So we have about 15 minutes left. We're going to take 2 more minutes to consolidate our thinking, and then we'll come back. We have some questions that are still left that are hanging there. We'll talk more about shortcuts. We'll address Joe asked about the phrase "it is what it is," and we'll see what we can say about that as well. So 2 minutes starting now. Okay, so we're coming back from that 2 minutes, and we're in the home stretch. I do want to make sure that we address some of those other questions. So I think both Kelly and Donna asked about, again, about the shortcut world. And what I have in mind when I think about the world that we live in of shortcuts are the things where essentially these are things that work against the way that introverts tend to think. So one of the first ones is social media, right? We talked about how introverts tend to value fewer deep relationships rather than many surface level relationships, right? Social media is built to establish hundreds or thousands of very surface level relationships, but it's not a medium for being able to engage with people, to get nuance, to really fill out their personality, and to have this deeper, more meaningful connection. There's also the way that we communicate, right? So there's lots of text communication, right? Text is not made for nuance, right? If I can reduce my sentiment down to an emoji, then that's exactly what we're looking for in the shortcut world. But the fact is that many of the things that we talk about, or what I think about something, probably has more nuance than I can put into a smiley face and a thumbs up. And you see this, I saw this even in the Air Force when I was writing for very senior level people. The dancing mushroom emoji is fantastic as well. I would write a paper, for instance, on using both subjects and verbs to explain the topic that we're talking about. What are the consequences of this topic? What are the consequences of this decision? And I would be fairly parsimonious, right? I would get it down to maybe 2 or 3 pages, but that's what I believed it took to understand what the problem is. And maybe it's a multi-billion-dollar decision. It's probably worth 2 or 3 pages of reading. But somebody would always say, you got to make it shorter, right? You've got to reduce it. Don't use both subjects and verbs. Let's see if we can get down to bullet points. In the end, it felt like they were asking for just a Facebook thumbs up or thumbs down when we get to the end of it. And you see this in lots of places where people don't take the time to read, because we value this quick conclusion that may or may not be right. In most cases, people will never know if it's right because they don't spend enough time thinking about the consequences of what they decided to get there. So I see this world that we tend to habituate ourselves to fast thinking rather than deep thinking. So the question is, how can you be more introverted to be able to I see that parsimonious is being defined in the chat as well, so that's great. But how can you thrive as an introvert so that you can still be yourself and still make your contributions and be heard in this world that is not aimed for that? And then Becky, I'll give you the first crack at the "it is what it is." What do you think about that phrase?
I think that it's a really great conversation ender in a lot of situations where it's often a way where it shuts down additional conversation. And one of the things that I talk about with my clients with some of this is, whether you want to say it, which means that you may want to shut down that conversation, then question, why is it that I don't want to talk about this anymore? What has exhausted me on this topic or in this conversation with this person that I feel like it needs to end? And the other side is when it's coming toward you and someone is saying it to you. And one of the things that I think about as a way to open that up is admittedly a very coachy question. So use this to whatever degree that you feel comfortable with it. But if this is what it is, what would you want it to be? If you could just make it anything that you want it to be, what would you want it to be? Because often when we're talking about it is what it is, we've kind of given up. We're looking at it from a lens of this is just done and we are unable to change it. And when we start to think about what's possible and what we would want for it to be, we start to actually energetically shift our thinking into the world of possibility, and we're not closing down our options anymore. So that's, whether you're saying it, you can ask that of yourself, or if you're in a conversation and they are saying it to you, it's an opportunity to really shift your mindset and potentially theirs as well.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks for, yeah. I mean, it is what it is. It's just a give up statement, right? It's just really, I want this conversation to be over. So there you go. That's another one.
Yeah.
So I always want to make sure that we leave with some very practical things that you can do, sort of the return on investment for spending the time with us, right? So the first was to practice saying, I don't know yet, to claim that space for yourself so that you say, I don't know, but you're committing to getting back to it, right? And you know that you're gonna spend the time thinking about it. The other one is one that I found myself using a lot, where I work to preload my brain, right? So I load up my brain with what I think about things so that if I am asked a question later, I've already sort of thought through that. So that I can, for instance, in this or in any of the workshops that I do or in conversations, you tend to have a similar conversation along the way. And if I spend the time being very introspective and understanding something deeply, then I have formed an opinion on that thing, right? And what I will do for myself is write down that opinion, and I do that in the form of articles that I turned into the Thinking Better book that I put out in January. And I would use those articles to go back later and read those to see what I think about it. Because I was disciplined in the writing, it forced me to make an opinion and to go through the typical introverted thinking style that I would use to think deeply about a subject and not have to do that every time. If you don't have the time to write, probably the next best thing is just saying it out loud to yourself. Right before this session, I went to a nearby park and I did a few laps, and I essentially practiced what I was going to say. Not that I end up saying it in a verbatim way, but I've already done the work in my brain to sort of sort through those words so that I can say something and I have the confidence that I'm saying what I actually think, and I'm not afraid that I'm going to say something that I don't actually believe because I haven't taken the time to do that. So Becky, I'd be curious, just in the last few minutes we have, if you have any other practical tips or advice that you would give to introverted skeptics or people working with introverted skeptics.
Yeah, one of the things that I would just echo, I guess, in what you had just said is going in prepared with your point of view, whether that's scripted out key points that you want to make in this meeting, or even key questions that you want to ask to try to focus and direct the thought of either the introverts or the extroverts who are in that room with you. That you actually empower yourself by going in, whether you're walking in with statements or with questions in those situations. The other is really kind of shadowing back to one of those statements that I had made before about show your work, that this incremental sharing along the path and showing some of the milestones that you're achieving when you're working with a group of individuals really ensures that you have that same alignment, and that you don't get shocked in the end and all of a sudden have a whole waterfall of information that you need to absorb because somebody had a great idea that they didn't tell you about, or you didn't capture it because you were kind of focused on what they said at the beginning of Dan's meeting that he was talking about, and by the time they iterated to the end, you had lost that thread. So really being able to sew those things together. The final one that I would leave really is this idea that someone had raised about the potential domineering extrovert. And part of it is that sometimes we have a responsibility to ourselves to choose whether or not we want to boldly name it when that's happening. And it isn't necessarily, Becky, you're being really obnoxious because you're kind of extroverting right now. That may not be the best solution to that, but it might be more along the lines of, hey, Becky, I know you have a lot to say on this topic. I'm processing and I need a minute for a second. Can you give me 20 seconds here to kind of absorb my notes and process through this? Name it so that they also get the feedback, and it's not the silent judging that sometimes that we do of other people who are in the room virtually or literally. So awesome. I don't know, Dan, if you had other ideas in addition to that.
No, so those are great. And as we're starting to wrap up, Kelly did ask for book recommendations. You've already mentioned Quiet. Are there any other recommendations that you would make?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I've always got my books back out on the shelf back there. I do think that one of the key books that is an oldie but a goodie is Crucial Conversations. I also echo Alan's recommendation in the chat about Adam Grant's new book. I think that is going to be amazing as a read. And to be honest, I don't read a lot of kind of the self books, the self help or self insight kinds of books. I'm more of an article because I absorb on a smaller bite sized basis than I do books of any great length. The other one that I do really like, though it's not about introversion or skepticism, is actually an energy leadership book. It's a premise behind um, the coaching program that I went through. It's energy leadership, and the name of the author is Bruce D. Schneider. And it talks about levels of energy and about how we have an opportunity to change our attitude moment to moment. And we live in a world of choice. And it's a go to thought process for me with my clients, with myself, and quite frankly, even with my family relationships. So it's very much universal in its applicability.
Awesome. Thank you. So what I will do is, as I was doing research for this as well, there was another book that I have not read yet, but I have ordered it from Amazon. I'm waiting for it to show up, is The Introvert Advantage, Making the Most of Your Inner Strengths by Laney. This is a little bit of an older book, but in all the research that I was looking at, people were referring back to this, not so much in the academic research, but in the popular research, people were pointing back to that as well. I will also send you an article that was written by a nursing student to her professor, essentially explaining how she showed up as an introvert. And I thought it was a really powerful writing because it communicated very authentically, but also there was lots in there that I could identify with, and it sort of builds that feeling of you're not weird, right? That this is a personality that folks have. And I'll also be glad to include a PDF copy of my my own book in the email that I sent out to you, just recapping the session here. But I know that we're right up against the time. I really appreciate your attention. And if you want to contact more with me, you have my email. You can always write me at dan@hi.training. And I'd be glad to set up a session to talk with you. Love to follow you on LinkedIn. I publish stuff there a couple times a week related to critical thinking, creative thinking, and collaboration. And Becky, how can they get in touch with you?
Likewise, absolutely love. If we're not already connected on LinkedIn, let's please definitely do that. And I post out there on a regular basis. I also like to post when I am doing presentations and the like. So encourage you to kind of join into any conversation that I'm in. I also do like every 3 weeks or so, I have a program I call Leaders Unstuck, which is where we just informally come together. And if you're stuck on a topic, then you can share it with me in advance. And we as a group kind of consolidate some of those pieces and talk through them. And the next one is March the 18th. So that's a short window, but if you look forward another 3 weeks, you could sign up for that one as well. So we can make sure that when Dan sends out a follow-up email, or else I do on my own, that I can make sure that you have that link as well. One other article I would share is just related to the energy leadership piece, is just really a bit of a white paper with respect to that too, to see how it affects individuals, teams, and organizations in terms of energy leadership as well. I find people view it to be pretty interesting as a read.
Great. So as we wrap up, the last thing I'd ask is, if you don't mind, if you could put a few words in the chat about what you thought about this session, how we could improve, or things that you wish we had talked about that we didn't talk about. We'll be glad to follow up with you there. And both Becky and I can hang out for a bit. So if you want to stay behind and ask any questions, we'll be here. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to getting to know you all better. Thank you.